Your education sector is the key to that next generation of the workforce.
Really breaking down those silos.
We have to start thinking of these things in an integrated way. I mean, age-related diseases, what is their impact on economic growth? It's all got to be connected, and I think there's a really exciting opportunity to do that right now and to consider long-term care part of Ontario's economic infrastructure.
If the COVID-19 pandemic made anything clear, it's that there is no health system without the health workforce. It is also made clear that there is a difference between recruiting and retaining staff in long-term care homes, and that both are vital to providing quality care. By 2029, Ontario long-term care homes will require at least 58,000 more nurses and personal support workers alone to meet increased hours of care and support residents in new long-term care spaces. These are frontline roles in Ontario's publicly funded long-term care system, caring for people whose health needs require 24/7 nursing support. In this episode of Coming of Age, I'm speaking with two experts to find out what needs to happen to create the workforce we want and need. Carolyn Treemstra is the Manager, Living Classroom and Education Engagement Lead for the Preceptor Resource and Education Program in Long-Term Care and Living Classroom programs led by the Research Institute for Aging through the Ontario Centres for Learning and Research Innovation. Her expertise focuses on therapeutic recreation, interprofessional education and practice, and aging. Daniel Tish Echevarria is President and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. He is a business, public policy, and community leader, having held executive roles in government and the corporate sector and senior governance roles at public institutions and nonprofit associations. Together, Carolyn and Dan provide invaluable insight into the progress we can make when we treat long-term care as essential economic and social infrastructure, recognizing that the workforce is the heart of every home across Ontario. This episode is generously sponsored by our sector champion, Point Click Care. Let's dive in. Carolyn, perhaps we can start with you with just your thoughts about the current workforce trends that you're seeing, especially as they relate to the health workforce.
Thank you for that question. Some of the trends that we're seeing where we engage with our long-term care home partners and education partners is challenges with recruiting certain staff and a little bit of ebb and flow with, for example, when the PSW lines are filled, then they have challenges with some of the registered staff lines and vice versa. We also see significant differences in different areas of the province where some of our rural and remote northern homes are experiencing greater shortages of different staff versus our urban areas where they may have more plentiful applicants to those roles. But when it comes to recruitment and retention, I'll say that what we're hearing overwhelmingly from both the homes and the education sector is that the government of Ontario's programs are supporting recruitment and retention. And when I say programs, there's a number of initiatives such as the PSW clinical stipend, which is attracting and recruiting students when they are students into that sector. And then, of course, there's opportunity for them when they become graduates. And so that's one example. We also know that different initiatives that the ministry or the government has supported in terms of PrEP LTC, including opportunities for homes to support students in their clinical environments, also living classroom where we're experiencing different pilot opportunities for students to be embedded in the curriculum within the long-term care home, provide an opportunity for that recruitment, which we anticipate will help them to be retained. They want to feel like they belong early on in their opportunities within the homes.
Carolyn, you spoke about something called PrEP LTC. Could you just explain what that is?
PrEP LTC is the Preceptor Resource and Education Program in long-term care, which is a Ministry of Long-Term Care initiative whereby long-term care homes and post-secondary education partners are connected to support clinical placements for PSW students and all different levels of nursing students. And what this has demonstrated is an opportunity for us to work with the long-term care homes to train preceptors to provide that quality clinical placement for students. It also allows the nursing programs, the PSW programs to be exposed to the long-term care sector even more than they would have in the past, where there is an incentive for the homes to support those student programs and build robust recruitment streams where students would have exposure to long-term care during their curriculum.
The province of Ontario has probably done more than any other jurisdiction to make commitments to invest in building a workforce specific to our long-term care sector, in large part in response to things we saw in the pandemic, but also in response to the aging demographic. Our long-term care homes are not just homes where people live and receive care, they actually are major contributors to our local economies. We know that in 2025, long-term care homes will contribute and or support over almost $13 billion to Ontario's GDP and about $9 billion in labour income, with about 166,000 as direct, indirect, and induced jobs to Ontario. Dan, you bring up where Caroline was at 10,000 feet. We're going to take you up to about 300,000 feet. When I look at those numbers around long-term care and its impact in terms of broader economy, it really does fit more into some of the broader labor trends. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what you're seeing in terms of some of those trends.
Yeah, absolutely, Donna. Well, thanks for the invitation to be part of the conversation today. I was noting some of the numbers you used, which are staggering. And frankly, that's why I wanted to be part of this conversation, because the long-term care sector is such a huge contributor to our economy and to our quality of life. And I'm not the only one saying that. Our businesses are saying that. It was interesting. We do a business confidence survey every year. It's currently in the field as we speak today, actually. But last year, when you ask businesses what's most important, what public issues do they care most about? Well, it won't surprise you, number one was taxes, but number two was health, right? And that's really interesting because you see businesses understanding the importance of the availability of high quality healthcare in their communities. And of course, we have many aging small business owners. The index is a little bit more mature than many other places. And a lot of people like me, we're in the sandwich generation, right? We have kids who are becoming young adults and we have parents that have significant care needs. That affects productivity. That affects our economy. We're a very broad coalition. We represent 60,000 businesses and through 145 local chambers across Ontario. And these businesses are everything from the biggest companies in the country, downtown Toronto, like the RBCs or Googles of the world, right down to local, small, very small micro businesses in remote communities. And so it's every size of business, every sector, every community. And we're certainly seeing, both anecdotally and in the statistical numbers that we look at, it really is a K-shaped economy right now. You see some sectors, some regions, some demographics doing very well, and some really struggling right now, right? And looking at long-term care, for instance, you can really see how there are really persistent labor shortages in some sectors, as there aren't enough jobs in others, right? And high unemployment in others. And everything we hear and what I hear from our Health Policy Council, we see persistent health workforce shortages, we see burnout, we see all this exacerbated by slow foreign credential recognition. That's an area we've been advocating a lot on over the years, and particularly this year, as we see an opening because there's more interest in bringing down those sorts of barriers by government to build our own economy. So we've been saying we need to get better and faster at licensing internationally trained professionals. We need to have better working conditions to support retention and training that combines clinical expertise with interdisciplinary skills, with tech skills, experiential learning. One of our big pillars is healthy communities. Another one of our big pillars is a skilled and diverse workforce. And I was encouraged to learn that work-integrated learning is much more common than I thought it was, but at the same time discouraged that it's a lot less than it needs to be. We certainly see young people really struggling right now, and the level of unemployment, the level of pessimism about the economy among young people, it's really troubling. It's something we have to worry about. And so anything we can do to enhance their experiential learning, their real world readiness, anything we can do to adapt to hybrid and technology driven environments, I think we need to be doing, right? Because they deserve a chance to participate in our economy and we need them. And I'd say the same about foreign trained professionals. We've got to look at these incredible resources and get them off the bench and into the game.
And Caroline, I think you had some examples of those, the new experiential approaches that Ontario is actually leading the way in developing. So the living classroom, preceptorships in long-term care, where you're doing active learning, also creating new competencies for frontline staff, where they become educators as well as a worker. I am curious, one of the things we've talked a lot about on previous episodes of this podcast and with some of our international partners is the nature of the work and how people want to work. So I'm curious, Dan, when you talk about that younger generation and some of the pessimism, we also hear a lot about agency staff and younger people actually want to work in a different kind of way, and perhaps the older models don't fit. So, Dan, I'm going to ask you that question. If you're have tested any of those trends in terms of the younger generation actually want to work in a different kind of way. And then, Carolyn, I know that some of the initiatives you're doing is really anchored in thinking about and working with the student population to figure out, okay, how do we work to recruit and retain? And thinking about it's a diverse workforce, but it's going to be a diverse workforce in terms of the breadth of age of the people who work in it more broadly, not just the narrow confines of perhaps the regulated professionals, but more broadly. Dan?
What I'd say is certainly everything I've seen suggests that young professionals in particular, they're looking for more flexibility, they're looking for clear development pathways, and they're looking for mentorship. And so what does that look like? Maybe they have more say in scheduling, maybe they have an opportunity to work more in team-based models. Development pathways, I think, for any employer right now is really important. Interestingly, I was in a meeting just this morning here at the Ontario Chamber for our staff. We have many incredibly brilliant young staff. And we've been talking about what's their pathway? How can we help them grow as people and professionals? And I think that that's very much, I think, an opportunity for every employer, but particularly in sectors where we're struggling with labor shortages, right? So we did a letter to the Ontario government after the election early in 2025 or spring 2025. And we actually explicitly called on the government to do more to incentivize more experiential learning, more mentorship, more technology-enabled learning, more work-integrated learning and micro-credentials, because we find these are really valued by early career workers. And then the other point I'd made was just the importance of mentorship, right? So I think talent are looking for industry professionals who can guide their development, build their confidence, build their practical skills. And I'm very privileged that the majority of Ontario's universities and colleges are members of the Ontario Chamber. So we get great feedback. And I think from an institutional perspective, the stronger the partnership can be between the local college and university and the local Chamber of Commerce or Board of Trade, the better, right? Because it's that tight connection between the educators and educational institutions and labor market needs of employers. So we need to tighten all of that and create incentives in the system to ensure they're working together.
It's so interesting that you talk about some of the scheduling elements and the flexibility in that. We've just come out of the Ontario Long-Term Care Association's This is Long-Term Care Conference, but also a Global Aging Summit and the Leading Age Conference in Boston recently. There was a huge focus on workforce optimization and AI. But what you're really digging into is the human experience of the workforce. And yes, we need to figure out how to optimize the scheduling and think differently about flexibility, but that human element and those connections about mentorship and connection.
We have an AI panel as well, an AI policy council. And it's interesting because one of my big takeaways from sitting in on the conversations this year is people think it's about technology. It's actually about culture and shifting the culture of organizations to enable and open up the workforce to technology-enabled change, right? It's what we do with the technology, how we manage it. Somebody was talking about how in some ways it's the revenge of the English grad. The ability to write a good prompt is as highly valued in this economy as the ability to create the technology in the first place.
Well, as a master's in English.
I thought you did. There you go.
So Carolyn, the living classroom model, the preceptorship model, all of these are really evolving. What are your thoughts around the nature of this new workforce? So yes, we have newcomers who are settling into our homes, into the long-term care sector, but also the new entrants, the new student entrants. What are they looking for? And are you finding that you're having to adapt the programming model to reflect or to adapt to the expectations of a new generation?
Yeah, I would say I could echo a lot of what Dan has already indicated in terms of that flexibility, the self-scheduling. Those are things that we hear. But when we talk to graduates, what we know is that when they launch into their education, they have a different set of expectations and understanding of what it might be to work in long-term care. And once they've had an opportunity to complete a clinical or multiple clinicals, they have a different experience, they have a different sense of belonging, and they talk more about the relationship, the relational element of working in long-term care. So in terms of working with residents and family members and other staff, definitely managing expectations is a challenge, and in that the younger workforce has expectations around perhaps full-time employment, and that's not always necessarily readily available. But employers also, I've seen this across several long-term care homes where they embrace their institution as a learning organization or teaching organization. And so they support all elements of that, from entry to practice learning to students completing full clinicals to then perhaps being hired on as a part-time individual with a mentor within the home. And Dan mentioned mentorship as well. And that's something that the Ministry, Ontario government announced just 2 weeks ago, infusion of dollars into a mentorship program in long-term care specifically. And so there's another example where, Dan, perhaps your letter to the newly formed government back in the spring, talking about mentorship globally or generally, it really does come to practice in long-term care. I would say that work-integrated learning is critical across both post-secondary and even before then, if we can get it into the earlier grades. But thankfully, all of our healthcare programs have required clinical elements, whether they're in a precepted model, whether they're in a group clinical model, or a different type of consolidation. It is a requirement, and the students must have that hands-on learning experience, which is what gives them that next set of comfort. So I believe it's a matter of the long-term care homes also embracing those partnerships and relationships with post-secondary to be able to support the students where they're at when they enter the long-term care, as an example, but also then to woo them into becoming employees. We have worked closely in the Prep LTC program and in Living Classroom. We work closely with the long-term care homes to ensure that also human resources or that HR element of the home is connected to the students, that this is not just about a clinical environment, that the students also need to know what it's like to become an employee. What is the culture like? What is the milieu like? And how can the students want to become that next generation employee? And so connecting them to the executive team, essentially everyone in the organization, but making sure that HR knows when the students are there, when there potentially are job opportunities, how to apply for those job opportunities so that you're securing them while they're experiencing that positive support in the organization.
Thanks, Carolyn and Dan. On those points, you've triggered a question for me. I was going to ask whether the reality of work actually matches what young people are being trained in. Each of you has really touched on something where it's almost a breaking down of the silos now, where it's not a siloed college program or university program and that are separate and you're going to go off and do a credential in that space. But the workplace has now become more of an integral environment for learning. Is that a fair point?
Coming from education, the education sector, I can tell you that our faculty, clinical supervisors, et cetera, those who are engaged in teaching students, they are doing a woman's job of trying to connect those professional requirements, the entry to practice competencies, the vocational learning outcomes, and delivering that information while making it real life and practical And so that connection between theory and lab, or theory and clinical, and theory and the actual workplace are critical. It's not an easy task. And faculty are constantly being challenged with, add this to the curriculum. We know that long-term care is a specialty area. We like to call it a specialty area. But others in, let's say, critical care, emergency care, mental health, they would classify those areas as specialty areas as well. We could argue all day that our students need additional training in how to support those who live in long-term care. So it's a challenge for faculty to meet those expectations, but I believe they're doing a terrific job of blending that theory, knowledge, textbook knowledge, and the actual practicality of what transpires in long-term care and how to prepare our students and our graduates for this setting.
It's such a good point, Carolyn. And I was going to say, we were part of some work with the Business Higher Education Roundtable earlier this year. And again, this is a very broad statement, but I think you might agree with it. It was interesting that in the research that was done, a lot of employers said the issue isn't technical skills. We're getting great technical skills. And so they were saying the top three things I remember that employers were saying they also valued were adaptability, communication skills, and entrepreneurship, not necessarily meaning go and start a business, but more to have an entrepreneurial approach, take initiative, be an intrapreneur within the organization, looking for opportunities and looking at how you can fill those opportunities. And again, I say this with humility because I don't work in the long-term care space, but I just have to imagine that the realities of long-term care, the higher acuity, the complexity of residents' needs, the administrative demands even, that it's presumably a very different from what you'd consider the theoretical or the ideal clinical setting, right? And so the more we can, I think, have good, strong LTC placements, the more we can have funding tied to labor market demand and partnerships that expand young people's skills beyond critical care, right? So I spent a week in the hospital last year, obviously not in long-term care, but I think the analogy will still be useful. There were various occupants of the bed beside me, and while I was there, and not one of them, of the three people who had that bed for that week or so, spoke English as a first language. And my God, like the quality of interaction when they had the family there with them was so much better than when they were alone trying to struggle to articulate what was going on, right? And so are we getting enough training in cross-cultural competencies? Are we getting training in communication and more broadly in leadership, in things that can help them navigate the messy real world of the workplace in a really complex environment?
Dan, I think that's a really great question. When we think about sort of competencies and work competency frameworks, whether those cross-cultural competencies, I'm curious, you said that the Economic Roundtable referenced adaptability as one of the things they're looking for. As we think about the labor shortages, do we need to pivot? Have we over micro-credentialed? My goddaughter's at university and just going for a master's program. And the scope of the program itself, this is at Oxford, was so narrow. So do we need to think more broadly now as we think about how we're embedding critical thinking, adaptability, and some of these other new competencies, not only into college programs, but also into these experiential learning models more broadly?
I do think we have to think broadly about the skills and the capabilities that they're accumulating and what they're learning and how they're learning. I'm very much in favor of micro-credentials, but maybe the way we look at it, more of a seamless, porous relationship over one's career between the educational and training institution and the workplace, right? Like make it easy for people to go in and out. And so maybe someone's in a particular job and they need to be upskilled in a certain area. So there's a micro-credential that's available for them on terms that make sense for both the employee and their employer. So it's something they can do, for instance, in small segments, so over their lunch hour or whatever, but looking at how they can get a credential that'll help them in that job, but not assuming that's going to be the end of it. I see as the nature of work changes and AI reinvents a lot of jobs, the question becomes, how do people keep upskilling and to reduce the friction between employment and education so that you see people doing that while they're employed, and also at times, of course, in their career, perhaps between jobs, but that we make it really easy for people. I don't think the education system and its funding models are set up for that level of flexibility. So that's an area where I think there's an opportunity for growth.
We've spoken about this as somebody who's been chaired a college board and had a past life in higher education policy. I'm really interested in the laddering and looking at competency-based models where you can ladder competencies instead of those micro-credentials to get to a full credential so that you can learn a skill or a competency, be tested on it, and then apply it. And the living classroom model really lends itself well to that. Go ahead, Dan.
No, please. I'm sorry. I thought you were finished. Continue.
I want to hear your insights because for our listeners, I do consider you to be a visionary and you bring really great insight. So I don't want to lose it.
Oh, well, no, I wasn't going to say anything terribly insightful. I was just going to clarify that I think the institutions are doing this. Like, I see them doing it. I see some amazing innovation happening. And I think we just need to ensure that, because funding is such a huge issue, it's a crisis, frankly, in post-secondary education right now, that as we develop, that we need to have the same long-term thinking around talent that the government is bringing to, well, it's got a health human resources strategy, it's got a life sciences strategy, it's got a critical mineral strategy, it's got an energy strategy. Okay, so we need that long-term talent strategy, and then we need funding models and incentives that are actually tied to the behaviors that we want and the sorts of offerings that we want from the post-secondary education system.
I would agree with that. And how do we support people for success? So just because coming in with an English degree didn't necessarily mean that I had the core knowledge to manage an office when I was working in politics and in government. In our long-term care homes, we had an older leadership cohort going into the pandemic. There was a lot of burnout. We had enormous turnover with the leadership in our homes. The leadership structure is an administrator, a director of care, and a medical director who's part-time. And so your administrator essentially does your health human resources, does all of your bookkeeping and your financing, and pays all your bills and all of your total administration. They're trying to manage intake into the homes in partnership with the care directors. In many cases, they're also having to look after environmental services, infection prevention and control, their local partnerships, they're doing government relations. They are in about 300 odd homes in Ontario. They are now developers, so they are redeveloping their long-term care homes and having to learn how to build a new long-term care home and navigate that. And so we don't fully appreciate the complexity of someone who may well have entered in as a nurse or a PSW, and suddenly more junior people have stepped in to these roles. And how do we support them with those competencies and fully appreciating the skills they take on? I've done that in running a community mental health agency where I was having to worry about replacing boilers and also managing an academic program. So you get that diversity of experience. Carolyn, I'm really curious. You've seen the living classroom model, the preceptor model work in sort of the core clinical areas. Do you anticipate that there are opportunities to support learning and more experiential learning for some of these other competencies that people working in long-term care may well need?
It's a really good point that the college sector in particular has been working on the bridging programs that to take people from a PSW level to an RPN or from an RPN to a BSCN, and looking at the inclusionary criteria to support all of the educational providers for PSW education, including our school board partners. There is a tremendous amount of interest and, quite frankly, recently output in developing accessible learning models, so high flex models of delivery. We know that during the pandemic, pretty much overnight, schools figured out how to put curriculum from in the classroom to online. And the pendulum has swung back to try to right itself a little bit. There has to be a proper mix of both in-person and high flex or hybrid learning. And some of the education sector leaders have been looking at how do we develop those high flex models so we can make education accessible to those who are interested. I am a fan of micro-credentials to a certain degree. I think there's a conversation to that. We must remember entry to practice competencies are just that. And what we expect new graduates to come into the workplace with are sometimes far beyond an entry to practice competency. People working in the trenches, so to speak, in long-term care, they've been doing it for a while. And often they forget what they felt like as a new graduate. That's where it comes back to that embracing the culture of learning and mentorship in our settings to be able to support individuals so that if there is a new initiative, for example, right now, there's one about long-term care homes staff learning more about caring for those with dementia and the ministry looking at how do we support advancing that skill set. That can be done in the home, and it can be done within the home's philosophy and within the home's sort of range of culture and vision. And it doesn't have to be a cookie cutter approach to every organization. And we should be supporting that. That's post licensure, that a nurse may learn more about this after they graduate. We do have to remember entry to practice competencies are just that. And it's a time where that mentorship piece is critical, that we help new graduates embrace their roles and responsibilities. And let's face it, a nurse, a registered staff walking into long-term care has a significant amount of responsibility, and we need to be able to support them along the way.
It does echo and amplify, Dan, your comment around mentorship. As you think about some of the other things those nurses may need to do, that's that bridge then to that entrepreneurship as you think about how you manage within the context of that workplace ecosystem. I know we're focused on long-term care, and we really like to see within the Ontario Long-Term Care Association, but also with our national partners and global partners, our ecosystems as being economic catalysts as well. I always give credit where credit is due. The government of Ontario has committed billions and billions of dollars to rebuild and invest in to build a new long-term care sector for the province of Ontario, our aging population. We all know the demographic trends. We know that by 2027, the rate of growth of the population over 80 in Ontario, that growth rate will start to double. We certainly recognize that no community that we're aware of is actually prepared for the baby boomers. Hypothetically, if we are able to meet the government's commitment, which is to build and rebuild 58,000 new long-term care spaces in the province of Ontario, what is the ripple effect that could potentially have? Dan?
I think it's quite exciting. I think there's urgency and huge challenge, but there's also incredible opportunity, I think, in achieving that goal that you just articulated, Donna. And I'm going to touch on one thing I said earlier. It creates jobs, and these are not just any jobs. These are stable, recession-resistant jobs, right? Particularly in local communities. And so our mantra is inclusive, sustainable prosperity. Well, these jobs are going to help make prosperity more inclusive and more sustainable because we're going to need them for the foreseeable future. But I also think about how we can help reduce unpaid caregiving burdens to people who are in the workforce right now and make them more productive and even boost their labor force participation. I ran into a good friend of mine on the street on the weekend, and I'd heard recently that she'd left her senior executive job. And I said, "What are you up to?" And she said, "Well, I'm looking after my parents." And it's a huge burden, right? Getting them into care, but also there's just a lot around that. And so I'm thinking, wow, there's such a brilliant person who we don't want her on the bench. We want her in the game, to use that image again. And so I think there's a real ripple effect once we do that. These local, these stable, these recession-resistant jobs, higher labor force participation, particularly for women, and also spin-off value, I think, to multiple sectors. I mean, we talked about micro-credentials and partnerships between long-term care facilities and colleges and workforce development agencies. All of these boats rise if we can get this right. So there are really few better investments that can be made in our economy right here, right now.
I actually have some data points on caregivers. If the government is successful in Ontario to do this, we will reduce the caregiver burden and distress by more than 845,000 hours per week across the province and create almost $25.4 million in income potential per week across the province. So that value of trying to address that caregiver burden is pretty powerful.
Interesting. And for clarity, Donna and I did not plan this in advance. We didn't coordinate. I didn't know she was going to have that stat, and she didn't know what I was going to say. So yeah, no, but that's pretty powerful. That's pretty powerful. And when I think one thing that we should think about doing, the Long-Term Care Association and the Ontario Chamber, is like together talking about this, right? Because we need to ensure that all stakeholders understand that this matters to business and workplaces and workforces and our local economies, to our local chambers of commerce and local businesses, right? We'll all be more prosperous if we can fulfill these obligations to people who need long-term care.
It really does feed into community stability. And our view, the definition we use in our association among our members is of aging in place is actually aging in your community, however you define it, and receiving whatever living and care supports you may require. You may require none and are able to remain in your family home, but you also may need supportive home care, but that you also need long-term care. And so how do we make sure that the services and supports are there for you within the context of your local community? This build is going to put huge pressure on us in terms of being able to create a new workforce. Really curious from your perspectives around the role of immigration. You touched on it earlier, Dan, around thinking about how we think about those cross-cultural competencies and who is our workforce. We know long-term care is a highly racialized workforce, but we also know that the people we're serving in different communities are highly racialized as well. And we know that we have huge pressures on our existing workforce. And if we're going to grow it, not only in Ontario, but for the benefit of Canada, especially now that we're looking at cross-border, cross-provincial mobility for our labor force in Canada. Dan, your policy wonk, how do immigration policy shape who's entering and staying? I would say not only on care work, but in other parts of the sector, because I know we want to build long-term care homes. We need construction workers. We need other people with other competencies.
Yeah, for sure. And I know this is something that's highly relevant to personal support workers and nurses in particular, but slow credential recognition, mobility barriers within Canada. These are handicaps as we try to overcome these shortages. This is something we've really been working hard with government on, and we think there's some progress. And it was interesting when Premier Ford became chair of the premiers last summer of 2024, went to meet with him, and he graciously took the meeting, and he identified certain priorities for his time as chair, including Canada-US trade, not surprisingly, and access to medications as two big. There were some other ones, but those are two really big ones. And I said, hey, I'd love to see Ontario use this year when you have this incredible leadership opportunity to help to bring down those interprovincial barriers to trade and labor mobility. And to his tremendous credit, he completely agreed. And then after the Trump madness started to unfold, he got busy. And Ontario played a leadership role. Vic Fideli was a big part of that too, in presenting Ontario in these negotiations. But instead of waiting for others to act, Ontario acted first. Now, there's still a lot that still needs to happen, but bringing down those barriers to labor mobility, that will benefit workers in our province, right? And actually, it'll benefit workers everywhere, right? And because they'll be able to go where the jobs are. For business, it's a way of addressing labor shortages. For consumers and citizens, it's actually getting the care and the services you need in your community. And for government, it's more tax revenue. So it's a win for everybody if we can do this. So we've also been saying there needs to be some national coordination, like a national licensure strategy, expanded foreign credential recognition for internationally educated professionals. We have these Ontario immigrant nominee programs that are targeted to sectors and regions facing shortages. And so we'd like to see that even more tailored and that used even more to target immigration for regions where we need them. And final point I'll make is that recruitment alone isn't the solution if workers burn out and leave. So I think we also have to look at workplace culture, at mental health supports, at staffing models, because all of this plays a role in not just attracting these workers and filling the roles, but also retaining them so that it is sustainable over the long term. Something I did talk about before, and that's the career development pathways, right? The understanding that the employer is invested in the employee's long-term career and their future is going to make the employee more invested in that employer. And to me, that's a real predictor of longevity and of retention.
I would agree. We hear from many employees that leadership is important, opportunity for growth and development. That doesn't necessarily mean moving up the ladder. It could be webbing, but they have an opportunity for that continual professional development and growth, whether that is through formal education, whether that's through perhaps becoming a mentor or a preceptor or leading a different committee, that it's the employer's responsibility to also think about the experience that their employee is living during their work with them. So it's not just the long-term care resident and patient family, it's also the employee experience along the way. And that does include definitely professional development opportunities. I can share that in the PrEP LTC program, we do a lot of conversations with the homes around workplace mental health and supporting the workers as preceptors. And so, of course, there's an opportunity for a stipend there, but it's not so much about the money. It's about the acknowledgement, the recognition, the appreciation. So certificates, we see a lot of celebrations around the work that they're doing. It's not always about the money. That helps, but that's not typically it's the acknowledgement of the work that's happening. Workplace mental health is critical. I know that the CLRI RAA specifically has a workplace mental health initiative where homes can sign up, their teams can do additional training, their leadership can do training to then bring that program to the home. And so it is about that work-life balance. It's about potentially having a quiet room in the long-term care home that is accessible to staff only. It's about having a massage chair and a student from the massage therapy program coming in weekly to do massages for the staff. It's those little perks that pay attention to the individual need, recognizing that their role is sometimes physical, sometimes very emotionally challenging and draining. What else can we do to help support them in the space that they're at? They want to continue to work. They just sometimes need a little bit of extra support along the way.
Having worked in academic health sciences centers and worked, including the community-based children's mental health agency that had a huge academic mandate, that academic mandate and that time out for learning and teaching also supports addressing compassion fatigue and burnout. So it puts some space between that heavier work and allows you to engage in a thoughtful learning experience. And that aligns well too with taking that time out to be mentored, to be guided by someone else and a leader, regardless of your work environment. I think those are really key things to how organizations could and should be thinking about building out culture. And every environment should and could be a learning environment. And we certainly hear from the students with whom we engage, they just want to continuously learn. And to Dan's earlier point, they want to adapt. They are nimble. And I think that they want to be valued and validated. And so that just puts a different lens, though, then on the competencies and capacities of leadership and how we build leadership and support leadership in leading. It's multi-pronged, multifaceted, and complicated because we're talking about social systems. Carolyn, would welcome your insights. On our podcast, we actually interviewed a participant in a living classroom who was a newcomer to Canada, who was a single parent, who talked about her experience in moving towards her full credential as a PSW, but then also getting into the laddering program to follow the RPN stream. And that successful collaboration between, it was Schlegel Villages and Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Curious as to your insights around and your experience as you're looking at the workforce, how some of the initiatives you're involved in imagine immigration policy really supporting us in building out the workforce that we're going to need.
Yes, it is a very complicated world right now with the immigration regulations changing over the last 18 months for students. And to that end, I will say that I believe all colleges and universities are doing a bit of a restart on their approach to supporting international students or having international students come to study in Canada, specifically in Ontario. As we know, Ontario had the largest number of international learners. It comes with opportunities, but also responsibilities. And when Dan talked about We can get them here, but we also have to recognize that cultural change challenges things like housing, transportation. How are we going to support internationally educated workers, but also international students when they apply to come to our country to help to support our workforce? We have a responsibility to ensure that they are supported beyond a job, beyond a student placement. Certainly, we know that there have been significant numbers of international students in our healthcare programs, and they are afforded opportunities, but they also struggle with the documentation, their visas, their study permits, their work permits, and they have so much more on their plate as they're trying to learn their skill, their scope, their practice, and that we as long-term care supporters, work employers, really need to look at how can we support them additionally. Don, I know that there are several examples of homes that have established programs that include housing, that include community participation, and arranging for some of their church organizations to support new landed immigrants and students who are studying or coming to work. That's critical that we pay attention to that full circle of how do we support them. And I will say, again, I think that the colleges and universities are looking at how do we support that international learner to entice them to come to Ontario specifically and stay. We know that the international students can be transient in that they might study at a location where their education facility is, and they might live in a different community. And so they're not necessarily completing a clinical opportunity where they may stay. And we need to understand that they're learning for the greater good of the sector, that they might move from one community to the next. But we do owe it to that group who are coming to support our health and human resource needs to provide them with that full circle support.
We had the privilege of having some students from the Philippines on an earlier episode who talked about how living in Sault Ste. Marie, the community embraced them. The one male nurse had an opportunity to get to know the local mayor. They set up clubs and cultural clubs where they were learning about not only our culture, but sharing theirs with the local community and really becoming more fully embedded. Those settlement supports, especially in rural communities, I think are things that we're certainly mindful of in terms of not just supporting an urban workforce, but those rural, the remote, northern and remote communities. How do we think differently also about supporting them and supporting newcomers and adapting to those communities? I know our Philippine students didn't necessarily enjoy the weather in the Sioux. They enjoyed the culture, but not necessarily the weather. But they felt fully embraced by the local community and fully supported, which again, it comes back to your point, Dan, about the context of these individuals supported within their broader communities where long-term care is just a part of the community. It's an employer, it's a supporter, it's now, to Carolyn's point, a big educator now and a big part of the learning ecosystem as well as the care and living ecosystem.
And the other point is we think of quality of life in the community, reducing the pressure on our hospitals, the ripple effects are so big, right? Obviously, there's the direct impact, but there's also as we discussed, increasing labor force participation, the role of LTC homes as significant local employers, and then less pressure on hospitals. There's so many spin-off benefits that I think are quite substantial and perhaps not sufficiently realized.
And thank you for sharing your experience of having been in a hospital so you would understand what the pressures look like inside a hospital and from a patient and family perspective as well. I have one final question for each one of you. You've spoken a lot about things we need to be thinking about to have training and education evolve. What would you see as the first step to that evolution to meet the needs and address today's reality and what we need to be planning for, say, for the next 5 years? What is the one key thing that you think would make the most difference to addressing the workforce challenge and some of the addressing training needs?
I would say it is enhancing the alignment and the collaboration between education and training institutions and providers, employers, and governments. If those three players can work more closely together and that we can ensure that there's a real alignment, the services being provided by educational institutions are aligned with labor force needs, both at the entry level and throughout the worker's career, right? And that government funding is incentivizing this collaboration. To me, that's where the real opportunity lies and where we have an opportunity to get so much better. So I've called the last year a wake-up call for Canada. I call it a call to action, an opportunity to actually pivot from this external threat, this unbelievable threat we have to our economy from south of the border, and actually say, okay, we're going to look after the things we can control. Well, here's one that we can, right? And I think it's also important to note that some of the impact of solving long-term care also relates to, so much of it is connected to the economy. We have to start thinking of these things in an integrated way. I mean, age-related diseases, what is their impact on economic growth, right? How many people live with dementia or Alzheimer's disease? Investing in all elements of critical healthcare infrastructure, diagnostic capacity, team-based care, primary and specialist care, public education, prevention, awareness, it's all got to be connected. And I think there's a really exciting opportunity to do that right now and to consider long-term care part of Ontario's economic infrastructure.
And really breaking down those silos. Carolyn.
You heard me speak a little bit earlier about long-term care homes embracing the teaching philosophy. We know that in our hospitals, we have hospitals that are teaching hospitals, formally legislated teaching hospitals. And I would love to see every long-term care home embrace that philosophy. But that comes with infrastructure. We can't expect the executive director and the director of care to be responsible for fleshing out that full partnership as an education institution or teaching long-term care home. There has to be infrastructure to support that. I feel privileged to have worked on the PrEP LTC project and the Living Classroom projects, where we have seen the opportunity where the ministry has infused dollars to support that teaching element and a focus on those educational partnerships. Far beyond personal support worker and nursing initiatives, we know that there are opportunities for students in every level of the long-term care home, as you said, Donna, from construction to implementation, operation, administration, and hands-on care, and everything in between. Your education sector is the key to that next generation of the workforce. And if those partnerships build early on and are a natural element to the school sector, whether it's post-secondary, but also including secondary and elementary, that we have an opportunity to build those bridges even closer and alignment than what they are currently. Dan talked about the long-term care sector and just the economic spin-off. Well, I mean, Donna, you would know the exact number, but it's well over 600 long-term care homes in the province of Ontario. In every single Ontario health region, it's significant. And there is plenty of opportunity for us to embrace that with some of that formal thinking and synergy work behind the scenes before students just simply say, can I come and do a clinical placement here? That's just the very tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we can do.
And such an opportunity to both of your comments around more structured partnerships. To Dan, you talked about we're going to have to be more efficient, more cost effective, really think about how we leverage those taxpayer dollars, but also the private sector dollars, and really think differently around alignment. Well, thank you to both of you. This is an area where, especially in our sector, Ontario should step up and say, we don't need to look to other countries. Actually, we should have other countries looking to us. And we know that we are. It's a starting point. We need to think about spreading and scaling these models, but also learning from other parts of the economy and different sectors and challenging one another, especially as the workforce evolves, technology evolves, and our existing workforce and baby boomers age. So thank you for inspiring me today. And I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for your leadership, and thanks to everyone who works in long-term care. We so value the work you do. Thank you.
This episode was generously sponsored by our sector champion, StaffStat. StaffStat is a workforce platform purpose-built for healthcare. From long-term care homes to hospitals, StaffStat eliminates the administrative burden of shift management through automation, real-time data, and predictive scheduling. Their platform empowers healthcare organizations to fill shifts faster, streamline internal processes, and improve communication between leadership and frontline teams, so staff can focus on delivering high-quality care. Connect for a discovery call and explore how they can support your team at www.staffstat.ca.